There's a famous line by Pablo Picasso that I always quote, and I would always quote this to my students when I used to teach art. Art is not merely to decorate the walls of our house or apartment. It should be used as a tool of war against the enemy. Some of the things that inspire me the most are subjects that involve things around social justice, the civil rights movement, African-American causes. A lot of these subjects I grew up with just in family, growing up in a family that was heavily involved in these matters, kind of inspired me to think about how I can bring those subjects into artwork, along with also having a major interest in comic book art. So I try to always fuse these different aspects of where these influences from different areas and bring them into one and have a voice and to be able to communicate to the viewer or the public what I want to say, and by having all these different elements. One of the things that I will say when I went to study at the School of Visual Arts as an art student in college, there was a kind of a vast divide between what was considered high-end fine art and then what was considered to be kind of like illustration art or comic book art. And back then in the 80s, it was almost very, I would say, an elitist attitude towards the fine arts, which were the painters, the fine arts painters, which you see in museums, and kind of like looking down on the illustrators or comic book artists at the time were just their own genre that wasn't taken seriously. But I've always loved both, and I've always, as a matter of fact, when I was in college, I even studied both. I majored in illustration actually, and then kind of minored in sculpting and fine arts. I love a lot of figurative art. I basically drawing people, I've done things that involve, like I said, things with social justice and other aspects of whether there's figurative works or even if they're nudes. But what I don't like to do is just reinvent the wheel. I don't want to just, if it's a figurative piece of art, then I don't want to just paint just a figure in a studio or something like that. To me, it's always bored me a little bit, and that's been done 1,000,001 times. So I always try to say, well, what can I do in my art that's actually going to tell the story a little different? I mean, the human figure has been described by artists since cave painting, since the dawn of civilization. So how do you give that a new voice? How do you bring it in to speak to your current day audience? That's always the challenge that I look for in each painting and each time or sculpting, whatever I do. And how can I take the figure and bring it into something new? Even growing up as a kid in the 1970s and early 80s, I would look at not just the paintings that were on our wall, but also a lot of the decor, a lot of the colors that were used. At the time, I was born in 1970s, so you were almost coming just right out of the African-American Civil Rights Movement. And, you would have a lot of the artwork, even in my parents' home, that were these African statues, or, some things may seem a little cheesy by today's standards, but almost like zebra skin rugs or something like that was supposed to be African. Now, how African a lot of these things were, no, but it was, at the time, our version of what they thought the Back to Africa was, and you had a lot of the Back to African movement with the Afro picks and all that. And to me, that stuff is not just memorabilia, it's nostalgic for me. And I like to take a lot of these elements that I grew up with and fuse them into my work today, because in a sense, these were my wonder year symbols. These were my icons of a time where, I was coming of age and where I was learning things and seeing the world for the first time. And these were the colors and the ornaments and the decor that I grew up with. I was raised in Baltimore, Maryland. I attended the Baltimore School for the Arts from years 1985 to 1988. Then I moved to New York, and I attended School for Visual Arts there, SVA. There I stayed there for 4 years, studied as an illustrator and minored in fine arts and sculpting as well. One of my first professional jobs that I landed was working as an assistant sculptor to artist Jeff Koons. At the time, he was working on this giant balloon dog he was starting, and I was brought in to assist on sculpting that project. I worked there for different projects for a couple of years. Then After that, I ended up doing more sculpting jobs just started coming in, a lot of commission jobs. I started towards the late 90s. I was still doing a lot of editorial illustrations for different publications and stuff. Here in New York, a lot of editorial magazines, such as Today's Black Woman were one of my steady clients at the time, did a lot of different illustrations for their monthly issues. So a lot of that is my background, and even that led into, I would say, for the last 15 years or so, I've been doing a lot of freelance sculpting, where the projects would involve things such as doing props for amusement parks or different kind of theme parks and settings. After that, I wanted to get more involved in more community projects towards the mid-2000s. You know, just being part of community and being active in the community just interests me in going more in that direction, and how could I take my art in that direction. In 2013, I was contacted by the mayor's office and offered a position to be director of the Mary McLeod Bethune Life Center in Jersey City, New Jersey. The Bethune Center then became more of an interesting project to me to want to take on, because it became an extension of creativity, the way I looked at it. It's like, okay, well, now you can bring something to the community on a different level. You have a chance to not just make your own art, but you can actually have a platform now to help other artists, especially artists in underserved communities, where we look at different type of African-American communities, or low-income areas, or low-income communities, Hispanic communities. The effect that I like for my work to have on people is, I guess the best way for me to describe it is, I want to create work that can't be ignored. So if it's in an art gallery, or if it's in a public setting, one of the worst things that I feel that we can fall into as artists is maybe sometimes doing work that doesn't necessarily catch the public's attention, or doesn't necessarily give people any kind of reason to talk about it. Sometimes I'm in art shows and stuff, and you see people conversating with each other, talking to their friends, and nobody's paying attention to the work on the wall. To me, if that happens, then I figured that my job as an artist, I did not do it successfully. If somebody can walk past my work and it becomes just background or wallpaper, then I feel I didn't do my job. So for me as an artist, I want to create work that has an impact on people, that makes you think, not necessarily that shocks, but if something shocks or causes some sort of emotion, whatever emotion that may draw from that person or from the viewer, it may be anger, they may be disgusted by a piece of work that I do, or they may love it. Either way, I take it all as a compliment that, okay, it had an effect on you. And that's what I try to portray in my work.